In 1960, rising Tejano star Freddy Fender stood in a Louisiana courtroom, facing years behind bars. The judge's gavel would silence his music for nearly 4 years. But what happened inside those prison walls would transform him from a local Texas singer into one of country music's most remarkable comeback stories. Today, we're diving deep into the dark truth about Freddy Fender's prison years and how those haunting experiences shaped the voice that would later capture millions of hearts. Before he was Freddy Fender, he was Baldemar Huerta, born to migrant workers in the tiny town of San Benito, Texas in 1937. Life wasn't easy for the young Mexican-American boy who spent his early years picking tomatoes alongside his parents in the scorching Texas heat. But Baldemar had something that made those long days bearable, an incredible voice that would stop people in their tracks. By age 10, he was already performing on local radio stations, earning a few dollars to help his family survive. The 1950s brought a new era of music, and young Baldemar knew he needed to adapt. He changed his name to Freddy Fender, inspired by his favorite guitar brand and the decorative piece on his classic Chevrolet. The transformation wasn't just about the name, it was about survival in an industry that wasn't always welcoming to Mexican-American artists. By 1959, Freddy had already tasted his first hint of success. His original recording of Wasted Days and Wasted Nights was climbing the local charts, and he was playing packed houses across Texas and Louisiana. Record labels were starting to take notice, and it seemed like the hardworking kid from San Benito was finally about to make it big. But success can be a dangerous thing, especially for a young musician in the wild days of early rock and roll. The endless nights on the road, the pressure to keep the momentum going, and the temptations that came with growing fame would soon lead Freddy down a path that would change his life forever. In May 1960, everything Freddy had worked for came crashing down. The rising star who'd escaped the tomato fields was about to face his greatest challenge yet, one that would test not just his music, but his very survival. The events that unfolded next would send shockwaves through the Texas music scene and set the stage for one of country music's most incredible redemption stories. The spring of 1960 started like any other for Freddy Fender. He was touring small clubs across the South, riding high on the success of Wasted Days and Wasted Nights. But on a warm Louisiana night, everything changed when police pulled over his tour car just outside of Baton Rouge. The routine traffic stop would become a turning point that would echo through country music history. What the officers found would make headlines across the South. 3 marijuana cigarettes, barely enough to fill a matchbox. Today, such a discovery might result in a small fine. But in 1960s Louisiana, especially for a Mexican-American musician, it meant serious time. The era's harsh drug laws, combined with the deep-seated prejudices of the time, would prove to be a devastating combination for the rising star. The arrest itself was controversial. Some claim Freddy was targeted because of his growing influence in the predominantly white music scene. Others suggested it was his reputation for drawing mixed-race crowds to his shows, something that didn't sit well with authorities in the segregated South. Local newspapers painted him as another Mexican troublemaker, conveniently forgetting the military service he'd given to his country or the joy his music brought to thousands. The trial was swift and harsh. Despite being a first-time offender, despite his rising star status, despite pleas from his family and supporters, the judge showed no mercy. Freddy's court-appointed lawyer seemed more interested in wrapping up the case than defending his client. When Freddy stood before the judge, he was told his music career and influence made him a threat to society's moral fabric. An example needed to be made. The sentence came down like a hammer. Nearly 4 years at the notorious Angola State Prison, nicknamed The Farm, one of the toughest penitentiaries in America. The facility was known for its brutal conditions, corrupt guards, and a reputation for breaking even the strongest spirits. Angola's reputation was so fearsome that even hardened criminals dreaded being sent there. For Freddy, the conviction meant more than just lost freedom. Record labels quickly distanced themselves, destroying copies of his records and canceling contracts. Radio stations pulled his music from their playlists, afraid of being associated with a convicted criminal. The momentum he'd built with Wasted Days and Wasted Nights evaporated overnight. His dream of breaking into mainstream music seemed permanently shattered. But perhaps most painful of all was the impact on his family. With their main provider behind bars, his wife and young children faced desperate times. They moved back in with relatives in San Benito, surviving on whatever work they could find. The shame and stigma of having a husband and father in prison weighed heavily on them all. His children faced taunts at school, while his wife struggled to explain his absence to curious neighbors. The once proud family of a rising star now found themselves back where they started, struggling to make ends meet in the harsh Texas economy. Inside Angola's imposing walls, Freddy Fender would face challenges that would break most men. But in the darkest corners of one of America's most notorious prisons, something unexpected happened. The young singer who entered those gates in chains would discover a depth to his music he never knew existed. And the lessons he learned during those long days and nights would lay the foundation for one of the most remarkable comebacks in country music history. Angola State Prison in the 1960s was a place of legendary brutality. Built on an old slave plantation, the 18,000-acre facility was known as America's worst prison. For Freddy Fender, his first day there set the tone for what was to come. Stripped of his identity, given a prison uniform, and assigned inmate number 82645, the man who once commanded stages across Texas became just another face in the crowd. The daily routine was grueling. Inmates worked 10-hour days in the cotton fields under the scorching Louisiana sun, supervised by armed guards on horseback. Fender, who thought he'd left fieldwork behind in his childhood, found himself once again picking cotton. The irony wasn't lost on him. From the tomato fields of Texas to the cotton fields of Angola, music had been his escape. Now it seemed like life had come full circle. Violence was a constant companion within Angola's walls. Fights broke out regularly, and the strong preyed on the weak. But Fender had one thing working in his favor: his voice. During his first week while working in the fields, he started singing. The other inmates stopped to listen. The guards, usually quick to shut down any disruption, let him continue. His music became a small ray of light in an otherwise dark place. The prison administration soon recognized his talent. They moved him to the prison band, where he performed for both inmates and guards during weekend shows. These performances became his sanctuary, the only times he felt like himself again. But they also came with a price. Some inmates resented his special treatment, while others tried to exploit his growing influence within the prison walls. During the long nights in his cell, Fender wrote songs on whatever he could find: toilet paper, paper bags, even the margins of old magazines. Without his guitar, he'd hum melodies into a contraband tape recorder another inmate had smuggled in. These raw recordings, though lost to time, were the seeds of songs that would later help rebuild his career. The isolation from his family was perhaps the hardest part. Visits were rare due to the distance and expense. Letters from home brought both joy and pain. News of his children growing up without him, his wife's struggles to keep the family together, and the gradual fading of his name from the music scene. Each letter was a reminder of the life he'd lost and the uncertainty of what awaited him after release. But prison also forced Fender to confront his demons. The endless hours of reflection led to deep soul-searching. He began to understand how his choices had affected not just his life, but the lives of everyone who depended on him. He made a vow that if he ever got another chance at music, he would do things differently. The prison guards had their own perspective on Fender. Several later recalled how his music would change the atmosphere in the yard. One guard, James Morton, would later tell the Houston Chronicle that Fender's singing was like having a professional performer doing private shows. Even the warden, known for his harsh treatment of inmates, would sometimes request specific songs during Sunday performances. The prison band itself was a mix of talented musicians who had fallen on hard times. Among them was blues guitarist Robert Pete Williams, who became a mentor to Fender during these years. Together, they would blend country, blues, and Tejano sounds during their performances, creating a unique style that would later influence Fender's comeback hits. Living conditions in Angola were notoriously harsh. The cells were barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with poor ventilation and extreme temperatures. During summer months, temperatures would soar above 100 degrees, and in winter, the cold would seep through the thin walls. Fender would later say these conditions taught him that music isn't just about entertainment, it's about survival. By the end of his second year, Fender had written over 30 songs, including a revised version of Wasted Days and Wasted Nights, that reflected his prison experiences. The lyrics took on deeper meaning, with each word carrying the weight of his time behind bars. These songs would become his emotional outlet, his way of processing the daily trauma of prison life. By 1963, Freddy Fender had served nearly 3 years in Angola. The experience had changed him profoundly, but his musical spirit remained unbroken. What happened next would test everything he'd learned behind those prison walls. As his release date approached, he faced a new challenge. Stepping back into a world that had largely forgotten him, armed with nothing but his voice and a determination to prove that his story wasn't over yet. Inside Angola's walls, Freddy Fender's music underwent a transformation as dramatic as the man himself. The prison band, known as the Cotton Field Blues Boys, became his new musical laboratory. Unlike the high-energy rock and roll he'd performed on the outside, prison audiences demanded something deeper, more authentic. They could spot a fake from a mile away. The band performed every Sunday after church services, playing in a converted maintenance shed they called the warehouse. Their instruments were secondhand, often held together with wire and tape. Fender's guitar, a battered Harmony acoustic, had been donated by a prison chaplain who recognized his talent. That guitar would become his closest companion during the long nights in his cell. Working with other imprisoned musicians opened new doors in Fender's musical education. There was Johnny Martinez, a jazz pianist serving time for armed robbery, who taught him complex chord progressions. Blues guitarist Robert Pete Williams showed him how to bend notes in ways that made them cry. Even the gospel choir director, a lifer named Big Joe Turner, no relation to the famous singer, helped Fender develop the soulful vocal style that would later become his trademark. The prison audiences shaped his performance style in unexpected ways. In the free world, crowds would dance and cheer. But in Angola, inmates sat silently, listening with an intensity that could be unnerving. They weren't just hearing the music, they were living it. Fender learned to connect with this captive audience on a deeper level, infusing every lyric with genuine emotion. His songwriting evolved dramatically during this period. Gone were the simple love songs and dance numbers. In their place came complex narratives about loss, redemption, and survival. He wrote about the young inmate who died in the fields from heat stroke, the old-timer who'd been inside so long he was afraid to leave, and the guard who smuggled in letters from inmates' children. These songs, though never recorded, taught him how to tell stories that resonated with real human experience. The prison warden, seeing how Fender's music helped maintain order, granted him special privileges. He was allowed to practice in the chapel during free time and was even permitted to arrange special performances during holidays. But these privileges came with expectations. The administration used him as an example of rehabilitation, parading him before visiting officials and journalists. Perhaps the most significant development was his mastery of bilingual songwriting. In prison, he found himself performing for both English and Spanish-speaking audiences. He learned to weave between languages seamlessly, sometimes within the same song. This skill would later become crucial to his crossover success, allowing him to bridge cultural gaps in ways few artists could. During his final year at Angola, Fender began experimenting with country music in earnest. The raw honesty of prison life aligned perfectly with country's emotional directness. He studied the songs other inmates requested most: Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, analyzing how they constructed their stories and connected with listeners. This study would later help him craft hits that appealed to both country and Latino audiences. His final months in Angola saw Fender perfecting what would become his signature sound. During a Christmas performance in 1962, he debuted a song called Holy One, which combined country steel guitar sounds played on a makeshift instrument with Latin rhythms. The response from both inmates and guards was overwhelming. Even the prison newspaper, The Angolite, praised the performance, calling it a new kind of music that speaks to everyone. The prison recordings, though crude, captured this evolution. Using a contraband reel-to-reel recorder hidden in the chapel's storage room, Fender and his fellow musicians documented over 20 original songs. These tapes, though confiscated during a cell search, proved that his time in Angola hadn't been wasted. He was emerging as a more complete artist, one who could speak to both his Latino heritage and his American experience. By the time his release date approached in 1963, Freddy Fender had evolved from a rock and roll singer into something far more complex. An artist who understood the power of authentic storytelling through music. But freedom would bring its own challenges. The music industry had changed dramatically during his imprisonment, and the path back to success would require everything he'd learned behind bars, plus something more: the courage to start over from scratch. On a crisp morning in 1963, Freddy Fender walked through Angola's gates with nothing but a cardboard box containing his few possessions and the songs in his head. The world he stepped into was different from the one he'd left. The Beatles were taking over America, the folk movement was in full swing, and his style of rock and roll seemed like a distant memory. The first weeks of freedom were disorienting. Back in San Benito, Texas, he found his family struggling to make ends meet. His wife had taken a job at a local diner, and his children, now 3 years older, barely recognized him. The local clubs where he'd once been a star now turned him away, afraid his prison record would bring trouble. Even his old musician friends seemed hesitant to associate with him. Determined to rebuild his career, Fender took any gig he could find. He played in dive bars under assumed names, performed at quinceañeras for pocket change, and even busked on street corners when things got really tough. His prison experience had taught him humility, and he wasn't too proud to start from the bottom. But the stigma of his conviction followed him everywhere. The music industry had changed too. Record labels that once courted him now wouldn't return his calls. Radio stations still had him blacklisted. One program director in Corpus Christi told him bluntly, "Sorry, Freddie, but we can't risk our license on an ex-con." The rejection was bitter, but Fender understood something crucial. He needed to reinvent himself. He took a day job at a garage in Harlingen, Texas, fixing cars to support his family. At night, he'd work on his music, incorporating the new sounds and styles he'd developed in prison. His voice had deepened during his incarceration, taking on a weathered quality that suited country music perfectly. He began translating country classics into Spanish, creating a unique fusion that would later define his comeback. The struggle took its toll on his personal life. His marriage, already strained by his imprisonment, couldn't survive the pressure of his relentless pursuit of a second chance. By 1965, he and his wife separated. The guilt of another failure weighed heavily on him, but the lessons learned in Angola kept him from giving up. He channeled his pain into his music, writing songs that reflected his experiences. Local musicians who heard him during this period noted a marked change in his performance style. Gone was the wild rock and roller of his early days. In his place stood a mature artist whose songs carried the weight of real-life experience. As one bar owner in McAllen would later recall, when Freddie sang about wasted days and wasted nights, you could hear the truth in every word. Through it all, Fender kept writing and performing, believing that if he could just get one more chance, he could prove himself. He took his new material to small recording studios across Texas, but the results were always the same: polite rejection. The industry wasn't ready for his blend of country and Latin music, or maybe they just weren't ready to take a chance on someone with his background. During these lean years, Fender often thought about his time in Angola. The discipline he'd learned there kept him going when others might have quit. He maintained a strict routine, working at the garage from dawn to dusk, practicing music until midnight, then starting over again the next day. His children would later recall hearing him practicing in their small garage apartment, his voice carrying through the thin walls as he perfected songs in both English and Spanish. Some nights he'd drive to the outskirts of town in his beat-up Chevrolet, park under the stars, and play his guitar for hours. Local teenagers would sometimes gather to listen, not knowing they were hearing a former star working his way back. A few of these impromptu concerts would later become part of Texas music legend, with witnesses describing how Fender would switch effortlessly between rock, country, and Mexican ballads, his voice echoing across the empty fields. But fate had other plans for Freddy Fender. Just when it seemed like his dream of a comeback was slipping away, an unexpected encounter in 1974 would change everything. The story of how a small recording studio in Texas and a producer who believed in second chances would help transform the ex-convict into one of country music's most beloved stars was about to begin. In 1974, Huey Moe, a producer known as the Crazy Cajun, heard Fender singing in a small San Antonio bar. Moe, who had his own history of second chances, recognized something special in Fender's evolved sound. The raw emotion in his voice, the seamless blend of country and Latin styles, and the authentic life experience behind every lyric. It was exactly what the changing music industry needed. Moe convinced Fender to record a bilingual version of Before the Next Teardrop Falls. The song had been recorded numerous times before, but never like this. Fender's interpretation, switching between English and Spanish, brought something entirely new to country music. Recording it in a single take, he poured every lesson learned during those prison years into the performance. When the song was released in early 1975, nobody expected what happened next. The single shot up both the country and pop charts, eventually hitting #1 on both. At age 37, after nearly 15 years of struggle, Freddy Fender became an overnight sensation. The ex-convict who once sang for prison guards was now performing on national television. The success of Before the Next Teardrop Falls opened doors that had been firmly shut since his release. His reworked version of Wasted Days and Wasted Nights, infused with the pain and wisdom of his prison experience, quickly followed to the top of the charts. The song's lyrics, particularly the line "Wasted days and wasted nights, I have left for you behind," carried a deeper meaning now. They weren't just about lost love, but about lost years and redemption. Television appearances followed, including spots on major network shows. But Fender never tried to hide his past. Instead, he spoke openly about his prison time, using his story to inspire others facing similar struggles. His honesty endeared him to fans and fellow artists alike. Even Johnny Cash, who had recorded his famous prison albums, praised Fender's authenticity. Throughout 1975 and 1976, Fender dominated country music, releasing hit after hit. Secret Love, You'll Lose a Good Thing, and Living It Down all reached the top of the charts. He won the Country Music Association's Single of the Year and was named Most Promising Male Vocalist. The boy from San Benito who had once picked tomatoes, the ex-convict who fixed cars in Harlingen, was now being hailed as country music's new superstar. But success didn't change the fundamental lessons Fender had learned in Angola. He remained humble, often performing benefit concerts for prison reform and helping other musicians who needed second chances. He never forgot the musicians he'd played with behind bars, and occasionally would invite former inmates to join him on stage, showing the world that talent could survive even the darkest circumstances. Freddy Fender's journey from prison cell to country music stardom remains one of the most remarkable comeback stories in music history. But perhaps even more remarkable was how he used his success to help others, proving that sometimes the darkest chapters of our lives can lead to the brightest moments of redemption. His legacy lives on not just in his music, but in the hope he gave to countless others who needed a second chance. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Freddy Fender's incredible journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Southern Sound. We're dedicated to bringing you the untold stories of country music's greatest legends.